Right. Good morning. This hearing will now come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Setting New Courses for Polar Weather Satellites and Earth Observations. This is a familiar topic to this committee and subcommittee. Since 2003, there have been 7 hearings before the Science and Technology Committee or various subcommittees on the subject of the National Polar Orbiting Operational Environmental Satellite System. Mercifully, there is an acronym, INPOS. Established in 1994, the program was intended to design, develop, construct, and launch satellites into polar orbits so that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the Department of Defense, DoD, would continue to receive daily data necessary for civilian and military weather forecasting needs. In the 2003 hearing, the life cycle cost for INPOS in March 2003 budget was $6.1 billion, with the first of 6 satellites expected to be launched in 2009. In last year's hearing, the life cycle cost estimate had grown to at least $14.9 billion, was intended to purchase only 4 satellites, with a first INPOS satellite launch pushed back to 2014. INPOS has continued to suffer from major performance problems and schedule delays for the primary imaging instrument, and those spawned cost overruns. The program has undoubtedly been snake bit, but at least we thought we knew the snake that bit it. The real problem appeared to be that the program was crippled by a management structure that delayed decisions at critical moments. The Tri-Agency Management Board proved incapable of making decisions and taking action when most needed. Last year's witnesses testified before the subcommittee that program leadership had deteriorated to the point that only White House intervention would assure that there would ever be any INPOS satellite at all. At that hearing, we were told that one agency should be put in charge of managing the program, either DoD or NOAA. OSTP did take responsibility for intervening to rescue the drifting program, but instead of putting one of those 2 agencies in charge, OSTP adopted the Solomonic solution of cutting the program in 2. Satellites flying in orbits to collect early morning observations would be developed and launched by DoD with their newly christened Defense Weather Satellite System. NOAA would do the same thing with their renamed Joint Polar Satellite System to collect observations in the afternoon. NOAA would operate all the satellites while in orbit and would manage the common data to receive, store, and share the data. With this decision, OSTP has removed the block over which we have been stumbling in the last few years, the snake that appears to have bitten this program repeatedly, but that is not all that will be required to guarantee success. There was a reason for having a single program in the first place. And splitting the program in 2 may simply create 2 programs with the same old problems. There are plenty of reasons to keep attention fixed on these new programs. For example, even though we now have clarity about what agency is responsible for which mission, this clarity apparently comes at the cost of delay and confusion about which instruments will be flown on which satellite and when will the satellite launch. There's a contractor that still has continuing work for the old INPOS program and subcontractors with instruments in various states of development. What is to be the fate of those work efforts, and when will those decisions be made? Our other discussion today grows out of our experience with INPOS. Back in 2006, all of the climate sensors being prepared to fly on INPOS were removed. If we anticipate having to deal with climate change, or I'm sure Dr. Broun would say the possibility of climate change, for decades to come, how can we eliminate a means for knowing how well we are doing? It has been clear that this decision was ill thought through and would have to be reversed. Without those sensors or similar capabilities, our ability to strengthen our Earth observation networks as a whole will be compromised. We asked GAO to examine the current state of the strategy for gathering necessary climate data. GAO's answer is that we don't have one, at least not a comprehensive strategy. That is a subject that we hope the administration witnesses can discuss today. We have spent almost $6 billion already on the INPOS program, the original projected cost of the whole program. There is not a single completed satellite to show for that time and money. We do have, however, 2 signs that read, "Now under new management." I know it is the hope of everyone here that the new management for the now 2 agencies, 2 programs, will be the solution to what is ailed INPOS. I now recognize Dr. Broun from Georgia, the ranking member of the investigation of this subcommittee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for your record, what I question is that human-induced global warming.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses here today at this important hearing, and thank you for your participation. This is the committee's first hearing on the Joint Polar Satellite System, but the 7th time we've looked in the previous program, the INPOS program, National Polar Orbiting Operational Environmental Satellite System. INPOS was originally planned to create synergies and cost savings by combining the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program within the Department of Defense and the Polar Orbiting Environmental Satellite System at NOAA. Instead, the program doubled in cost, shrunk from 6 to 4 satellites, degraded its sensor capabilities, and its schedule slipped 6 years. Now, 15 years later, we're back where we started. At last year's hearing, I asked the questions. How did we get here? And where do we go from here? My question today is, where are we going? The administration announced plans to restructure the program last winter, but as Mr. Powner points out in his testimony, quote, because neither agency has finalized plans for its acquisition, the full impact of OSTP's decision on the expected cost, schedule, and capabilities is unknown, unquote. Until we receive this information, we can't fully review this new program. While it is understandable that it will take time to restructure, I hope the administration consults with Congress and with this committee in particular, given its history with the program. I look forward to working with the administration and with the chairman as we move forward. As I said at last year's hearing, every American is impacted by this program, whether they know it or not. It is our responsibility to ensure that the farmers, fishermen, warfighters, and everyday commuters continue to receive weather and climate information. But we must not forget to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money and root out waste, inefficiency, and duplication where we can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Broun. I now ask unanimous consent with all additional opening statements submitted by members be included in the record without objection, so ordered. It is now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Dr. Shere Abbott is the Associate Director of the Energy and Environment Division in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Ms. Abbott directed the task force established by Dr. John Holdren, Director of OSTP, to evaluate changes in the management of the INPOS program. Ms. Mary Glackin is the Deputy Director, Undersecretary for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Ms. Glackin supervises NOAA's transition to the follow-on Joint Polar Satellite System and the expanded cooperation with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to develop afternoon orbit satellite coverage. Mr. Christopher Scolese, is the Associate Administrator for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. NASA will resume its traditional role of supporting NOAA in developing the JPSS weather satellites, and Mr. Scolese will testify today about the changes that will be needed to bring NASA into the program. Mr. Gil Klinger is the Director of the Space and Intelligence Office, providing oversight for all Department of Defense space and intelligence programs within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Mr. Klinger is currently elaborating what changes, if any, DoD plans to make for polar weather satellite coverage in the wake of the decision to transfer responsibility for acquiring morning orbit satellites to DoD. And then finally, Mr. David Powner is the Director of Information Technology Management System Issues at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. Mr. Powner has directed GAO's team monitoring of the INPOS program for this committee. since 2001. GAO's report last year and Mr. Powner's testimony at the subcommittee's previous hearing was central to the convening of the administration's task force, and he has 2 reports to share with our subcommittee today. As our witnesses should know, you will have each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have all completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. It is the practice of the subcommittee because we are an investigations and oversight subcommittee, to receive our testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objection to taking an oath? The record should reflect that all the witnesses said that they had no objection to taking an oath. You also have the right to be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel here? The record should reflect that all of the witnesses indicated that they did not have counsel here. Please now stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Okay. The record should reflect that all of the witnesses took the oath. I should say, for purposes of understanding the flow, there is a likelihood that we will be called for votes at an awkward time, probably in the middle of the opening statements. But we'll go as far as we can, and we will break and come back after our votes. So let us now begin with Ms. Abbott. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear today to discuss the decision to restructure the MPOS program and the administration's efforts to improve capabilities for Earth observations. As you, Mr. Chairman, noted, the MPOS program was created 16 years ago to combine civil and military operational weather satellite capabilities that would provide global weather coverage, storm tracking, and climate monitoring requirements. The tri-agency construct of the MPOS program was intended to integrate the talent, technology, and resources of the agencies into a single converged operational system. DoD was responsible for major program acquisitions and contract administration, NOAA was responsible for satellite operations, and NASA was responsible for developing new technologies. In spite of this vision of coordination and efficiency, and in spite of multiple attempts to improve its execution, the program has consistently been behind schedule, over budget, and underperforming. At the request of Dr. Holdren, Assistant to the President for Science and Technology, I convened an Executive Office of the President task force on this matter starting in August 2009, with participation from the Office of Management and Budget and the National Security Council. Working closely with the 3 agencies, the task force performed a thorough analysis of the program, its content, cost projections, budgeting, acquisition issues, and related management options. The task force found that the major challenge of NPOS was its structure, jointly funding and executing common ground on a single program with a single common platform and a uniform set of instruments. This is because the 3 agencies have different technical objectives, acquisition procedures, engineering and management philosophies, risk tolerance, and approaches to managing budget adjustments. These differences led to continued developmental challenges, escalating costs, and increasing risk. In consultation with the agencies, the EOP leadership decided to disaggregate management of the satellite programs by proceeding with separately managed acquisitions. The key elements of the restructured program will retain the observational requirements of the NPOS program. However, NOAA and DoD will be responsible for meeting these requirements through their assigned orbits. NOAA, with NASA acting as the acquisition agent, will be responsible for the afternoon orbit. DoD will be responsible for the early morning orbit. The European Organization for Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites will continue to provide observations in the mid-morning orbit. The agencies will continue to partner in those areas that have been successful in the past, such as a shared ground system. The NOAA portion of the restructured program is called the Joint Polar Satellite System. The DoD portion will be called the Defense Weather Satellite System. This structure is codified in the sector guidelines in the National Space Policy released yesterday. The program restructure accomplishes the following goals. First, it reduces the risk of schedule slips and cost increases by clarifying acquisition authorities. Second, it allows each agency to manage its program within its own agency culture and environment. Third, it provides clear accountability, responsibility, and authority for each orbit. Fourth, it allows for greater government control over the development process. Fifth, it retains strategic coordination across the civil and defense programs. And sixth, it aligns with proven acquisition centers. I want to be clear. We're not canceling the program, but merely restructuring the procurements to put the program on a pathway to success, taking maximum advantage of government expertise. We'll be using all of the taxpayer-funded investments for the future satellite programs. The decision is supported by the long history of reviews called for by the Congress and the agencies, as well as independent reviews of the program. Plans for continuity of a number of Earth observations from space have been tied to NPOS at one point or another in the program's history. With the NPOS decision behind us, the administration is focusing on the broader issue of the development of a comprehensive strategy for Earth observations. We're working internationally through the Group of Earth Observations toward the development of an integrated Earth observing system with leadership from the U.S., provided by the agencies through the U.S. Group on Earth Observations. In addition, the substantial increases in funding as part of the President's proposed FY11 budget for NASA's Earth Sciences program will be used to address the pressing issues related to the nation's climate research and monitoring capabilities and climate data continuity. And the administration will be drawing on the analysis of the U.S. GEO as a first but very significant step in the development of a comprehensive strategy for Earth observations. In conclusion, OSTP will continue to play an important role in coordinating interagency satellite observation policy, successfully restructuring the NPOS program and ensuring continuity of weather and climate data has been a high priority for the administration's leadership team. We will continue to meet regularly with NOAA, NASA, and DOD to ensure a smooth transition of the program to meet the nation's need for weather forecasting, storm tracking, and climate monitoring. I look forward to working with the committee as we move the NPOS program on a pathway to success and as we move forward with a broader national strategy for Earth observations. I'll be pleased to try to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Ms. Glackin for 5 minutes.
Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Brown, and distinguished members and committee of the members and staff of the committee, I too appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of you today. I've been working closely with Secretary Locke and Undersecretary Lubchenco to ensure the continuity of the critical weather and satellite data that this nation needs. As has been highlighted here by the opening statements, it was imperative that a decision be made to address the acquisition challenges facing the NPOS program. NOAA's follow-on program to NPOS, the Joint Polar Satellite System, or JPSS, will address our requirements to provide global environmental data and support our mission. Since the administration's decision to restructure the program, NOAA has taken several steps to ensure that there's uninterrupted, reliable weather and climate data. We have established a transition team, including members from the Department of Commerce, NOAA, and NASA, with participation of the Department of Defense. We've made significant progress moving forward, including defining the organizational structure and beginning the process of locating and staffing the JPSS office. NOAA and NASA are assuring that we have high-performing teams working on the program, and in particular leveraging and the placement of the civil workforce that we have at the Integrated Program Office today. Concurrent with these activities, we've also moved forward to ensure that the NPOS requirements for the afternoon orbit are appropriately translated into program-level requirements for JPSS. The Integrated Program Office oversight has been reassigned to the Air Force Space and Missile Systems Center. We have a NOAA senior engineer with significant experience that's been assigned to work with the center for close coordination. The IPO has issued guidance outlining priorities for work stoppage and, in particular, ensuring that we maintain the NPOS preparatory project NPP cost and schedule as a top priority. Due to delays in the NPOS program, it's been necessary to repurpose the NPP satellite from a research mission to an operational satellite. All the instruments have been delivered for integration onto the NPP satellite, and NOAA is supporting NASA's efforts for launch of this satellite. The JPS afternoon orbit will maintain observations that were planned for NPOS in the afternoon orbit. We anticipate that NASA will assume management control of these sensor acquisitions in early fiscal year 2011. NOAA will continue the development and fielding of the ground system network that was to support NPOS and its users. The President's budget provides adequate resources to support NOAA's efforts for completing the development of the ground system, which will be used by both DoD and NOAA for both the morning and afternoon orbits. As I've mentioned, continuity of data is a top priority and the basis for all of our considerations. After careful analysis of technical costs, schedule, and programmatic risks, with input and advice from NASA, NOAA has decided to procure a clone of the NPP spacecraft bus to support the JPSS-1 launch readiness date of 2014. We believe an NPP clone will carry the same suite of instruments and collect the same data as NPP, provides a proven solution for placing these sensors in orbit. This will allow us to meet our launch readiness date in 2014 and minimize the potential of an observation gap. We're still working with NASA and DoD regarding the spacecraft decisions for the second spacecraft that will support a 2017 launch readiness date. During this transition phase, our ability to make final decisions are still coupled with the Department of Defense. Due to DoD's decision-making timeline on the spacecraft bus, a level of uncertainty still exists regarding the resolution of the Northrop contract. Until the contract is resolved, NOAA will continue to be exposed to additional procurement schedule and cost risk. I would like to briefly address the two GAO reports that are subject to this hearing. NOAA agrees with the recommendations in both reports, and I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the tremendous effort of OSTP has undertaken over the years to address the importance of continuing critical space-based climate observations. With respect to the GAO report released at this hearing addressing risks that jeopardize continuity of weather and climate data, we appreciate the perspectives of the GAO professionals in their regular reviews of the NPOS program. The report provides recommendations to both the Secretaries of Defense and Commerce, and NOAA agrees with all recommendations in this report. In conclusion, NOAA appreciates the committee's continued interest in the success of the agency's satellite programs. It's widely acknowledged that satellites are very complicated and difficult systems to design, build, and operate. However, NOAA is acting quickly to support the February 1st, 2010 decision to restructure this program. And I too, would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Glackin. Mr. Scolese for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss NASA's role in and commitment to the JPSS program. This program is crucial to the nation's ability to make important weather and climate measurements. NASA's role will be to manage the acquisition and integration of the JPSS program elements on behalf of NOAA. As the nation's civil space agency, NASA is fully prepared to support JPSS. NASA, and more specifically NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, has over 40 years of experience developing large-scale operational space systems for NOAA. NASA Goddard developed the first operational weather satellite, TIROS-1, launched in 1961, and has continued to support NOAA through development and deployment of the geostationary operational environmental satellites and the polar orbiting environmental satellites. Further, NASA has decades of experience developing and supporting Earth observation system research satellites. Many of these capabilities serve as prototypes for operational missions, such as the Aqua satellite, launched in 2002, that demonstrated the capabilities intended for JPSS. At present, NASA is developing the NPOS Preparatory Project, NPP, to serve as a gap filler for the afternoon orbiting weather satellites. I must emphasize that NPP was originally intended to be a risk reduction mission for the NPOS provided instruments, so the lifetime and data delivery requirements are not the same as for JPSS. However, the experience that NASA and Goddard have obtained working with the NPOS program and its contractors on NPP have provided considerable knowledge of the critical systems required for JPSS. Therefore, the acquisition of JPSS, while a large task, is extremely well aligned with the existing capabilities and experience of Goddard. The JPSS program at Goddard will lead integration across all of the elements of JPSS to ensure delivery of the required data products for weather and climate. This activity includes spacecraft, ground systems, and instruments, including the critical visible infrared imaging radiometer, cross-track infrared sounder, advanced technology microwave sounder, and ozone mapping and profiling suite of instruments. All three agencies remain committed to a partnership that preserves and enhances the nation's weather and climate measurement capabilities. The three agencies have established a joint team to transition the NPO's contracts and activities to the responsible agencies with as little disruption as possible. And we expect to have contracts or contract modifications in place by early fiscal year 2011. NASA is working with NOAA to establish a high-caliber team of experienced personnel to implement JPSS. The team will be a combination of NASA and NOAA employees with significant experience in acquisition, spaceflight development, and Earth remote sensing. For NASA in particular, the JPSS program team will be composed of personnel from NPP, as well as members from the successful Hubble Space Telescope Servicing Mission 4, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the Solar Dynamics Orbiter, and the recently launched GOES-N series of geostationary satellites and missions. Last, I would like to report that all of the instruments for NPP have been delivered for integration with the spacecraft, including the NPO's provided VIIRS and CRIS instruments. With now a full complement of instruments, we are beginning testing with the ground system and anticipate a launch date of late 2011. In summary, NASA is committed to a successful JPSS program. NASA will build on its long relationship supporting NOAA and our experience with operational and research Earth observation satellites to minimize data gaps and provide the nation with the critical operational observation capability it needs. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I appreciate the support of Congress and this committee and would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you. I believe we can get the opening testimony in. We'll be called to vote during it, but we have 15 minutes, which really turns out to be 25 minutes. So at least, so we can complete the testimony. Then I suspect we'll break. You will be at ease, and we'll return and ask for our questions. Mr. Klinger for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Brown, members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss the Department of Defense's role in assuring continuity of the nation's environmental monitoring mission in light of the restructuring of the National Polar Orbiting Operational Environmental Satellite System program. As the Director of the Space and Intelligence Office for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, I'm pleased to join my colleagues here at the table today. I think our presence here today reflects our collective commitment to continue to work together to meet our nation's weather needs, and that's certainly the Defense Department's position. The Environmental Monitoring Mission serves a critical role in day-to-day weather forecasting and provides critical support for nearly all defense and national security users. So I share your concerns about preserving continuity of environmental data for all users. In this regard, I'm pleased to report that the Department of Defense, in close coordination with our interagency partners, has made considerable progress in executing the administration's direction to restructure NPOs and to continue to pursue capabilities needed to meet the nation's environmental monitoring needs. Since receiving the EOP direction, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics has chaired 3 Defense Acquisition Board reviews to assess follow-on options and acquisition approaches to address DoD responsibilities under the restructure and ensure transition of former NPOS elements to the appropriate acquisition agencies. At a minimum, the DoD program, designated the Defense Weather Satellite System, or DWSS, will be available for launch in 2018 and will meet or exceed Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, or DMSP, legacy performance while ensuring mission continuity in the early morning orbit. The DoD is deliberately studying available options to ensure that we strike the right balance of cost, performance, and technical risk while staying within current budgetary constraints. To meet the on-orbit timeline required, the DoD will leverage technology and previous investments in the NPOS program. The DWSS and JPSS programs will share a common ground system based on that designed for NPOS. Under the restructure, ground system development is a NOAA-NASA responsibility. NOAA will operate DoD satellites on a reimbursable basis as it does today for the Defense Department with respect to DMSP. Additionally, the Visible Infrared Imager Radiometer Suite, or VIIRS, and Space Environmental Monitor, NPOS, SEM-N, are prominent in our plans for use on the DWSS program. The Air Force is also developing an implementation plan addressing the most appropriate microwave sensor and satellite bus to meet DoD requirements and the attendant procurement strategy. Further, the procurement strategy will seek to maximize the government's investment in NPOs. It will focus on the best mix of cost, technical risk, and capability, and where applicable, support NOAA's JPSS program. We plan to finalize our procurement strategy not later than August 10th of this year. Weather observation and forecasting has greatly improved over the last 4 decades, due in large part to space-based environmental sensing. Global, high-resolution measurements of atmospheric temperature, density, and humidity populate mathematical models for weather prediction. Our warfighters need accurate, time-sensitive weather data as a key enabler for maneuver planning, weapons employment, and intelligence collection. DWSS will continue to provide critical global environmental information to effectively employ military capabilities and aid in the protection of national resources. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Mr. Klinger did not use all of his time. Outstanding. Mr. Powner for 5 minutes.
Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Brown, and members of the subcommittee, we appreciate the opportunity to testify on the disbanding of the NPOS program and our broader report on the need for a long-term strategy for climate and space weather observations. First, NPOS. When the task force led by the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy decided in February of this year to disband the NPOS program and go back to separate satellite acquisitions for NOAA and DoD, many viewed this as fixing the problem. As our report being released today points out, we are far from fixing the problem. First, both NOAA and DoD's programs are not completely defined, nor are the detailed costs and launch schedules. Although to their credit, last week both NOAA and DoD announced the key sensors they plan to pursue in their separate acquisitions. Transition risks are significant. These include loss of key staff, supporting the other agencies' requirements, and litigation costs. Near-term budgetary challenges are also a major issue as the agencies are continuing work on NPOS while starting their new programs. In addition, they're slowing work because contractor termination liability payments and other litigation costs are still unknown. Because of this, we are recommending that NOAA and DoD expedite decisions on the capabilities of the separate satellite acquisitions and the associated costs and launch schedules, and to effectively manage the transition risks. In addition, the major issues that led to NPOS's failures are still relevant to the new programs, and neither NOAA, NASA, or DoD should lose sight of these. These include technical complexity. Specifically, the VIIRS instrument plan for the first JPSS satellite is high risk. Contractor and subcontractor oversight and performance should be a major focus area, as should rigorous program management. In addition, an executive-level oversight structure still needs to be defined for the new programs. Finally, the agencies can't repeat the past poor interagency coordination that plagued NPOS. NOAA and NASA will need to work together effectively on the new civilian satellite acquisition. Failing to effectively manage these transition risks in the separate satellite acquisitions could result in the combined programs costing more than NPOS. In addition, further launch delays are likely to jeopardize the continuity of weather and climate data. Of particular concern is keeping the demonstration satellite known as NPP on schedule, as it is to replace the final operational pose that is expected to reach the end of its lifespan at the end of 2012. All indications are that NPP will slip further than the 9 months indicated in our report. Turning to the larger data continuity issue, in 2006, when the NPOS program was restructured, several climate and space weather instruments were removed to save costs, knowing that these could be addressed later or on other satellites. This complicated an already chaotic approach to our nation's long-term environmental satellite observations. There is no overall strategy to ensure continuity of climate and space weather observations, despite the fact that for over a decade, federal agencies and the climate community at large have clamored for one. Interestingly, a White House-sponsored interagency working group has worked on a short-term strategy and has even drafted a report that identifies and prioritizes these climate observations. This could form the basis for a long-term strategy that ensures our nation adequately monitors the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, land, and space environments. As we heard this morning from Ms. Abbott, OSTP plans to work on this strategy. In summary, Mr. Chairman, NOAA and DoD need to define and effectively manage their separate satellite acquisitions now that NPOS has been disbanded. But in the near term, the transition risks need to be effectively managed. Once the scope of the respected programs are agreed to, any additional gaps in environmental observations will need to be addressed in the strategic planning efforts currently being led by OSTP. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Powner. Mr. Brown is recognized for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Rohrbacher, who's a member of the full committee but not the subcommittee, be allowed to participate as if he's a member.
I'll wait longer than I usually would for an objection to that. All right, without objection, that's so granted. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I could yield
Yes.
for 30 seconds, I'd like to thank Mr. Powner for y'all's hard work, and I particularly want to thank you for your yearly reports and all that you have done for this committee. Without your hard work and participation, it'd be very difficult for us to do our job. So thank you very much. Are you back, Mr. Chairman?
all right, we now need to go vote. You all are at ease. We will be back. The topic of this hearing is not really one of the partisan fault lines in American politics, and the Republican staff does not object to our going forward, so we will go forward. But I'll recognize myself now for 5 minutes of questions. I know this isn't fair, and it's a lot more complicated than this. The DoD had different needs from NOAA, but the solution of having NOAA have one satellite with the afternoon orbit and DoD having its own satellite for the morning orbit felt a little like a kindergarten teacher sending two children to different corners because they can't stop arguing. And we do need you all to get along. The DoD needs to get data from NOAA. NOAA needs to get the data from DoD, and we need to make sure that you all will play nice in the future. Mr. Klinger, what plans does DoD have to work with NOAA to make sure they get the data that they need, and to make sure that you get the data from NOAA that they have that you need?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's not just the plans that we have. We actually have ongoing interaction right now with both NOAA and NASA. Start with one point. We're going to continue the relationship we've had that I mentioned in my opening statement with respect to ground operations, the ground system and the on-orbit operations. The Defense Department will be dependent, just as it has been, on NOAA for the ground system and for the operations, day-to-day operations, as we are with our current generation, the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program. But looking forward, one of the reasons we are moving very deliberately within the Defense Department is to ensure that we do not take an action unilaterally that inadvertently places any of NOAA or NASA's equities, and specifically the NPP program, in a disadvantaged position. So everything that we are doing with respect to the Defense Weather Satellite System is measured and assessed not just through the lenses that we would normally use on a DoD-only satellite system, which would be defense and or intelligence equities, but in fact we thoroughly ensure first within the department that we're not going to do something that disadvantages one of our civil partners, whether that's in terms of thinking through what we want to do in the morning orbit, but absolutely with respect to what changes we end up making, if any, to the existing contract. So we and NOAA, NASA, in my view, are inextricably tied together in terms of how we move forward, though, as you pointed out, there will be separate spacecraft programs provisioning the morning and afternoon orbits.
Okay. Ms. Glackin, how about NOAA's plans to play nice?
We're very comfortable with the arrangement we're moving into. We have literally, again, decades worth of history in cooperating with the Department of Defense and sharing meteorological data. We work closely with the Air Force. I personally established a working relationship with General Sheridan, who's the director of Satellite and Missile Command out in California, that will have oversight of Defense Weather Satellite System. And we've been talking back and forth, as has Mary Keyes, my director of our satellite line office. So I think that we have this experience doing this. We have a lot of commonality among our users for sharing of data there. We work closely through the Office of Federal Coordinator for Meteorology as a central focus for coordinating requirements and things like this. So I'm quite comfortable in moving forward.
Dr. Abbott, does OSTP plan to play a continuing role in assuring the necessary cooperation, information sharing, et cetera, between DoD and
Yes, we
NOAA?
do. Yes, we do, because it is of great interest to Dr. Holdren and myself to see this decision through to an endpoint. And I would add that all along, from the beginning of the task force's operations until reaching a decision, the communication and coordination across the agencies has been extraordinarily good. We've had a lot of difficult moments in which we've had to deal with some issues that were hard to decide, but in fact the cooperation has been quite good, and we have been able to negotiate through a lot of challenging moments. And I think at the end of the day, we've got a program going forward that is consistent with the visions of the agencies and their particular programs, and it makes some sense for the nation.
Okay, my time has expired. I now recognize myself for a second round of questions. Mr. Powner, you in your testimony in the GAO reports, you said that there are still challenges and uncertainties in a polar satellite program. What is your take on the importance of agency cooperation and what must be done to address any issues there effectively?
Well, just reiterating, touching base on some of the points that were made, I agree with Ms. Glackin that there's decades of experience, but if you look at the NPOS program, that was not a model for interagency coordination. So it's great that Mr. Klinger is making comments and we're going to work together. I think the key thing moving forward is if you look at the first satellites that are planned, the NOAA satellite, JPSS, is almost identical to NPP. I mean, that's the plan, and when you look at the initial plan for DoD, you clearly see their requirements. When you look at the microwave sensing capabilities, the SEM instrument that Mr. Klinger mentioned, I think it would be very important as they go forward with the 4 satellites that there's a sharing of the sensors that will be included so that the different agencies' requirements are considered. That was clearly one of the transition risks that we mentioned in our report, that taking into consideration the other agencies' requirements is still vital moving forward.
Okay. Mr. Powner, you testified that we still do not have a comprehensive plan strategy for climate observation. Who is it that you think should be in charge of developing that comprehensive policy, that comprehensive plan? How should we go forward to make sure that we correct that deficiency?
Well, I think there's been some initial steps through the Office of Science and Technology Policy. There's an interagency working group, and they've put together some initial plans that lay out the climate observations that we need to ensure that there's continuity. I think there's 17 key observations that they're focused on, and the key going forward is that OSTP continues to exercise that leadership role so that we have the appropriate interagency coordination for continuity of all those key climate observations.
Okay. Ms. Abbott, you, of course, heard the testimony earlier and know the GAO's view on this is what role does OSTP plan to play in making sure there is a comprehensive plan for climate observation?
So as I said in my testimony, now that the NPOS decision is behind us, we actually are going to focus attention on the follow-on to that U.S. Group on Earth Observations report and to try to turn some of those considerations of the 17 priority areas into real priorities aligned with budgets, aligned with agency cooperation and coordination, and developing a strategy from that.
We'll take just a 2-minute recess. I think that there are members who are planning to come back, or there were, and I think we need to check on their status. If not, we'll be done, but we'll be in recess for a couple minutes. And you all can talk among yourselves. I think we'll now be back in. So I understand Mr. Vilray is on his way, but I'll now recognize myself for a third round of questions until he gets here. And these are questions I think that Ms. Dowkemper had intended to pursue had the hearing today not been disrupted. Undoubtedly, the reason that there are so many well-behaved people in the room today is that there are still a lot of unresolved questions about contractors. Certainly Northrop Grumman has been waiting with bated breath for the resolution of some of these issues and perhaps others as well. GAO has criticized the program as not having made the transition decisions necessary. What role do you see for Northrop Grumman in the now two new programs, the now two programs, and what can be done to expedite any decisions made with respect to Grumman. Ms. Glackin.
I think that what I would comment on is NOAA and Department of Defense, I believe, are both very interested in leveraging the expertise and experience and investments that the government has with Northrop Grumman. However, we've made no final decisions in going forward at this point.
Mr. Klinger.
I'd echo what Ms. Glackin said. As I mentioned in my opening statement, one of the things that is a priority to us within the department and also to our civil, our agency counterparts and partners is to maximize the degree to which we can take advantage of the investment that we've made in NPOS. And that at the first order includes the expertise that Northrop Grumman as the prime has gained. In general, at the moment, I'd just offer the following, that the contract right now is under the purview of the Air Force and its contracting officer. We're still working through what the specific changes that will attend the restructuring will have, and that may or may not require some renegotiation and changes to the contract. I don't think as a result it's appropriate for me, nor are we really ready at this point to provide those details. There's no question that as the Air Force sorts through that, in the run-up to the deadline of August 10th, the Air Force will prepare and update the acquisition strategy, including the specific contract issues, and those will be submitted through our office to the Undersecretary, Dr. Carter, and then that'll become clear.
Okay. Mr. Powner, any observations on the need to, or how to expedite issues with contractors, or how to resolve those?
Well, clearly, I think a key decision moving forward will be the size of the bus. In the, clearly with JPSS-1, they decided to go with an NPP-like bus. But the size of the bus will drive decisions. That'll be a key driver going forward in terms of the amount of contract leverage that Ms. Glackin mentioned.
Okay. Well, despite the fact that I have 2 minutes left of my questioning, I will now yield back to myself the balance of my time, and now I'll recognize Mr. Bilbray for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me sort of follow up and ask for sort of a clarification on something that's near and dear to a lot of us that spend a lot of time out in the water. Thousands of Americans, both in the military and civilian, depend on the EPIRG locating devices, the emergency satellite communication systems. And there's an assumption out there that if an aircraft goes down and that EPIRG goes off, that the authorities will be there in a very short period. Will know you're in trouble, know where you are, whatever. What has happened with the search and rescue satellite-aided tracking system in the system, and what's going to be the impact to the consumer on this?
I'd be happy to take that one. I certainly agree with you, sir. Search and rescue capabilities that our satellites provide are really a tremendous benefit to society, and in particular to mariners and aviators. This type of instrument we've flown for some period of time. It turns out to be a highly reliable instrument, and for the most part lasts long after the life of other instruments on a spacecraft. So today, for example, in the afternoon orbit, we have 3 of these that are currently running and operational. With our decision to go with an NPP-like clone for the JPSS-1, that particular instrument won't fit on that bus. However, we're still searching and we'll be looking at whether we in fact need to fly it because of the redundancy up there, and on what platform we'll fly that in that time frame. So that remains an open question now, but you should not doubt our commitment to ensuring the continuity of that capability.
Well, I really worry about seeing that get bumped on this technology because, when we've got a F-18 go down, the system's being depended on for pilots. We require it on American flag boats. We really encourage civilian mariners to carry this, and this assumption that somehow the United States will keep this umbrella protection. I had the experience this last year of losing, being dismasted off of Nicaragua with my family. There was assumption there that if we really, really needed something, we could flip that switch, and with a matter of hours, people would know where we were and we were in trouble. My biggest concern is what is the lag time now, and should we be telling our consumers now that, look, maybe you want to go to the spot system, maybe you want to invest in a private alternative because the federal government's facility is not going to have the coverage or the capability that we said it was going to have within the next couple of years.
Yeah. Congressman Bilbray, I'd like to assure you we will have that capability there. We're committed to providing that. It was part of the JPSS suite. So as we make decisions going forward on exactly how we'll fly that instrument, we'll certainly keep this committee and you informed about that.
Now, without the polar sensors, which are really the locators, I mean, our stationaries can tell us that somebody's in trouble, but trying to figure out where they are precisely is absolutely essential on this. How do we make that assurance if we're not going to have that as part of our polar system?
It will be included in the JPSS system. It's just not going to fly on the first bus that we have announced. So we have more decisions to make, and we'll be making them in the months ahead about how to fly the one climate instrument that isn't flying called TSIS, the Total Solar Irradiance, as well as search and rescue, and there's a third set of instruments known as user services, data collection capability. So all of three of those announcements are yet to come.
That's based on an assumption that there is a budget for this?
That's correct, and there is. The President's fiscal year 11 budget includes all of the resources for that.
Do we have that's a proposed budget?
It is a proposed budget, yes.
So, you know, we're still in this thing, and I hope that we all remember we're still operating with a proposed budget from the executive branch, so all of this is still up in the air.
Absolutely.
And so we've got to make sure we condition that if we can get this thing approved, if we can go down there, you're sure on this. Let me go back to this total solar, sensor issue. It almost appears to somebody who would be a skeptic that why would the federal government be backing off on this sensor when we're talking about the potential climate change, whatever? Because I think we all agree the greatest skepticism is coming from those who are saying that the impact of the solar flares and the solar impact on the temperatures is grossly underestimated by models. We're operating off that. To retreat from having those sensors would almost leave some of my colleagues, including my surfing buddy to the right here, to claim that there might be some cynical conspiracy to make sure that data is not collected because it may show that the modeling have grossly underestimated the effect of solar radiation. Yeah. What would you say to my colleague about that kind of perception?
I would like to assure you and the committee that we've not backed off from flying this sensor. We will fly this sensor in this time frame. The announcement that we made to fly an NPP-like bus, which is a smaller bus, is driven by our need to avoid a gap in this afternoon orbit. It represents the lowest technical and schedule solution for us. So we're still working on our exact plans for flying these three sensors that do not fit on that bus, but you should not doubt our commitment to ensuring those will be flown.
Now look, I'm going to be very frank with you, is that the American people watch what's going on in Washington and what's going on with the federal government. There's a lot of people making a lot of promises that affect average Americans' personal lives, their health, their lifestyle, their prosperity. And a lot of people in this city is telling the American people, trust us, we can get this done. Trust us, we can do the job properly. When the American people see the handling of this proposal, where you've got, multiple jurisdictions and what looks like an absolute shambles of a strategy and implementation, I mean, you understand why people really do get concerned when Washington expands its footprint, say we're going to manage personal lives of people better and don't worry about it, and they sit there and say, look, you've got groups like the federal government for a decade has been trying to do electronic medical records and no closer now than they were 10 years ago, or the fact that we're talking about our satellites, and look what you guys did with that. You expect me to trust you with my family's future. How do we tell the American people that, look, we can learn from our mistakes and we can move forward? How can we say that don't use this as an example of how the federal government screws up? What can I tell my constituents out of this experience?
Yeah, I think the Restructure of the NPOS program does three things for us. One is it really clarifies the acquisition responsibilities. Number two, it allowed us to propose a budget to the Congress that we think is adequate to cover what's here. And the third is it allows us to align with a proven acquisition center that can bring the government expertise to bear for the oversight of this. As part of that last part of it, I'd like to highlight to this committee that NOAA and NASA will use independent review teams. So over and above what GAO might do in this program, we will use independent review teams to review our plans, assess our progress. We've been doing that with the GOZAR program. We'll be doing that with JPSS as we move forward. So we're not just allowing it to ourselves and our own oversight, but we're seeking independent review as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Rohrbacher is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank my colleague for asking the questions in my name, of course. First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for holding this very significant hearing, and I think the witnesses have given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate the high caliber of witnesses that we have. Notice it said that we've gone from, NPOS has gone from $7 billion in 2002 to $15 billion. Think what could we have done with all of that extra money that Brian was talking about, and I guess we could have given it to Goldman Sachs coalitions and things like that. So there's been a lot of money wasted here in Washington, D.C., a lot of money over the last couple of years, and I would hope that this was a, let me put it this way, this was a try. They were trying to accomplish something, and they did not succeed in accomplishing what they set out to do. And I think that is less of a waste than some of the money that we spent in the last 18 months in the name of stimulus that has gone into the pockets of wheeler dealers on Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. But back to this. When we're talking about why this failed or how we couldn't reach the goal that we had in mind, one of those things is one of those goals the technology we needed to make the climate determinations. There is a difference between climate and weather, and the technology for this project, between determining what weather is going to be and the whole idea of climate research. Was the technology needed for this climate research, which I consider to be very, very questionable goal in the first place, was that part of the failure that we have here?
No, sir, I don't think it was, because
Okay.
there's a mission flying today that we launched several years ago called Aqua, that is flying sensors that were the, if you will, the predecessors of the sensors that were selected for NPOS. And they are doing climate and weather measurements, although it's a research mission, so it's not tied into the operational stream. So the technology and for accomplishing what NPOS was going to do has been demonstrated. It is flying. And one of those sensors has been flying for over 10 years now.
But it was so that it would not be accurate to say that climate change, which some of us believe is not man-made, and thus we believe, frankly, it's a phony issue. But that commitment to studying that and the technology needed to do that study was not part of the reason why we went from 7 to 15 billion and have not been able to accomplish the mission.
I would not say that the technology was, no.
Okay, does anyone else have a comment on that? Okay. How much was this? Okay, so what do we say is the cause of this debacle? Do we say it was there, in fact, that was technology that we couldn't develop Did we have a problem with procurement problems here? Was it the launch systems that we know there was some problem here with launch, which launch systems we were going to be able to do this? Or is this just a lack of, when in the beginning it sounded like it was just we had too much confidence that various bureaucracies could work together. So what was the main driver of this debacle?
I'll take a cut at that and invite my colleagues to chime in here. But I think as this committee heard last year when they did a hearing on this and heard from Tom Young, the independent review team chair, he highlighted several things. One is the overall management structure and because of the agency's missions, responsibilities, their postures and all, the difficulty in being able to provide adequate oversight. He also highlighted to this committee that we were developing this satellite system in a way that neither NOAA, NASA, or DoD would develop one on their own. And that, in fact, meant that we weren't using a proven government acquisition center. So we weren't availing ourselves of talent that we had within the federal government to provide.
So the bureaucracy wasn't right. I mean, it wasn't because it hadn't done this type of thing before, right. And it wasn't the technology. But we have, didn't I hear Mr. Powner suggest that there's still some technological risk at play right now?
Yeah, Mr. Rohrabacher, there's one sensor that is VIIRS, which has caused some problems with some of the overruns that you mentioned, and with JPSS-1, the first NOAA satellite, that's still not out of the woods. But I would directly answer your question to say that every level was at fault with NPOS. There was issues with executive level oversight, with the tri-agency overseeing it. There were issues with program management, managing the program. And there were issues with contractor and subcontractor oversight and performance. So there was almost every layer you look at, there were issues when you look back over the years with what went wrong.
We wish all of you success in trying to put this back together again so that $15 billion that's been invested by the taxpayers don't just go to waste. So if we can, so thank you very much for focusing on this and being very frank with us today. And we will be following this project and hopefully get it done so that we can salvage something out of this effort that's of value to the American people. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
All right, I understand that Ms. Dalkemper is on her way, but no, she was not. Okay. My new information, she will not be here. I now recognize myself for one more round of questions. Mr. Powner, you mentioned the VIIRS sensor as being the one that was the most difficult. Is that for climate research or is that for weather forecasting?
I think when you look at VIIRS, it's probably a combination of a number of things. And clearly VIIRS is on NPP, the demonstration satellite that's going up, but it's also being built for the first NOAA satellite. And in our report being released today, we do mention that that satellite right now is viewed as high risk for that first NOAA satellite.
Ms. Glackin, what will be the effect of a continuing resolution on funding for the 2011 budget year, and will that affect a launch date for the two new programs?
Yeah. The President's fiscal year 11 budget is critical for us being able to move forward with the JPSS program. So in the event of a continuing resolution, I believe we'd work through the administration with Congress to see what our options are to be able to move forward here. We're quite sensitive to the fact that this is proposed as a new program in the 2011 budget, and Congress hasn't made a determination on that yet. So we've been working with both this committee and our appropriations staffs as well in that regard.
Okay. Mr. Klinger, same questions?
Yeah, I'd just echo what Ms. Glackin said, which is that it's imperative that we get those funds to begin the DWSS program. So we will be doing essentially mirroring what NOAA does in the event of a continuing resolution, which is to work through the administration and secure the release of funds that are appropriated.
Mm-hmm. I like that the two of you are agreeing with each other. That's All right. Ms. Abbott, do we have a comprehensive catalog of our existing assets for Earth observations, and do you have a understanding of the set of observations that need still to be obtained?
The, excuse me, the USGEO report that I mentioned before that Mr. Powner spoke of, and their report notice is the first step in developing such a catalog. The agencies got together and identified the seven, through looking through the lens of environmental policy requirements, what are the major observations that are needed to address those policy issues. And so we have what is close to a catalog of needs. What we don't have is the articulation of that catalog against a set of priorities and budgets. And that's the next step.
Mr. Scolese, I understand that the new JPSS program will be run out of the Goddard Space Flight Center. How many positions, both NASA and contractor staff, do you expect to manage this acquisition, this new program? And how will those staffing levels compare to the INPO's Integrated Program Office, which was projected to have about 170 staff?
Well, let me take it backwards, if you might. One of the reasons that Tom Young suggested that the program be put at an acquisition center isn't because of the number of people that are on the project, but because of the number of people that can support the project. At Goddard or at the Air Force's SMC, we're procuring or building lots of satellites and lots of sensors. And all of that technical capability with our engineering directorates and safety and mission assurance directorates and science organizations in the case of Goddard come to bear to help that organization go off and achieve its goals by having the ability to look across many projects that are some ahead of where you're at, some behind where you're at, some using the same contractors. You can identify issues that a individual project that's isolated, as the IPO was, wouldn't see. So the fact that it's at the Goddard Space Flight Center is probably the most critical element of the program, because you bring all those resources to bear to help the project succeed. As far as the size of the project, it would be about the size of the IPO, about 100 or so civil servants and contractors working it. And the staffing is going to come from very experienced people, as I mentioned in my opening statement. We're bringing some of the best people from our projects. The lead of it will be the very successful leader of the Hubble servicing missions. We're bringing in as their deputy the person who did the Solar Dynamics Observatory, who's built a number of satellites, and we'll be bringing in people of that caliber, or have already brought people of that caliber from NASA and NOAA and the IPO in to go off and manage this program and oversee it.
I now recognize Dr. Brown for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Mr. Bilbray had a question. If is that correct, I would yield to Mr. Bilbray.
With the Chairman's permission. Question about the sensors. Are we including maintaining capability to be able to detect ozone and suspended particulates?
Yes, we are. We have the OMPS sensor, both the nadir and the limb, as part of JPSS-1.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, just for the record, I know people in this committee have chuckled about the whole concept, but I think that we've really got to understand how important this aspect is of the suspended particulates and its effects and the ozone issue, because there has been legitimate concerns raised about people considering, is global dimming a factor we need to consider or not? And the argument's gone back and forth. But just to articulate how important this could be, if global dimming is a significant issue, as some have said, we have to totally reverse our policies on implementation of climate change legislation, because rather than looking at things like coal, which should be the first operations, I know that makes you upset, first operation shut down, there may be a whole argument to reverse that decision and have it as the last CO emissions shut down, because there may be major short-term benefits there that would help to mitigate. I just want to make sure the good science on this is out there, and this sensing could be a critical component. I just hope we keep our minds open as we develop these strategies. My biggest concern I've seen is too many people are making assumptions based on 1970 concepts when there's a whole lot of new data and technology out there, and this data may be critical at getting those of us in Washington to rethink our entire implementation strategy and actually reversing our implementation strategies based on new data. So I'm glad to hear that. I think it's critical. It'll at least answer some questions and make sure, reassure us that our assumptions may continue to be followed up rather than having to be reversed. And I'll yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, I've got some written questions that I will submit for written responses if I could get y'all to do that. And so I'll just ask one question orally today, and that's of Ms. Abbott. OSTP has stated that this is a restructuring and not a cancellation. How do you believe this affects the Nern-McCurdy law, which says that 15% over budget, Congress has to be notified, 25%, it has to be reauthorized? So how do you think this affects the Nern-McCurdy law?
Mr. Congressman, I'm not an expert on the Nern-McCurdy law, but I think that the restructuring that we have proposed is not over those limits. And I think that as we move forward with the DoD portion of this program, we will have a better sense of what the costs are going forward.
If it does go over, or is Congress going to be informed about this, and
yes.
Will you divide the programs, or what's your plan regarding that?
Dr. Brown, if I may, since Nern-McCurdy is focused mainly on DoD acquisitions, perhaps I can elaborate a little bit on
Mr.
that.
Klinger.
Yes, yes, sir. From our calculus right now, the restructuring does not constitute a breach under the Nern-McCurdy statute, nor would, although our estimates are not final with respect to the funding profile associated with the Defense Weather Satellite System, we are working within the funds that we had previously planned to use for our share of NPOs. So we believe that the DWSS, as it moves forward, would not cross any of the Nern-McCurdy breach thresholds. But if for some reason there were a breach, by definition, we would do the necessary reporting and subsequent work for recertification.
Does this mark a rebaseline?
There will be a new acquisition strategy for the DWSS, and there will be a new acquisition program baseline that the Air Force will bring forward to OSD as part of the definition of the new program, or of the restructured DWSS.
Well, I look forward to hearing back from you guys what's going to go on with that. So,
yes, sir. We'll be happy to do that.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. That ends the questioning at the hearing. Dr. Brown has already said that he has questions he'll submit in writing. I may as well. Other members may. Before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before our subcommittee today. Under the rules of the committee, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for answers to any follow-up questions the subcommittee may have for the witnesses. The witnesses are excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.